Hello, Patreon.
Hi,
How are you?
doing well, thank you.
Do you want me to call you Patreon or Dr. Smith?
I think you can call me Patreon.
You okay with that?
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me in your office and giving me your valuable time to talk about your
Sure.
work and your book, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So, we'll start out with you telling us a little bit about where you grew up, what country, and what was your childhood like.
So I grew up on the island of St. Lucia in the Caribbean. Quite a fascinating experience to have grown up there, primarily homeschooled as a child, meaning that I spent a lot of my time on the farm with my siblings, my father, my mother, and just really, I would say, not a traditional sort of childhood, if you want to think about it in that way. Um, Having, for example, being homeschooled meant doing assignments at home, and basically, my father, who was a principal, would come back in the evening after my mother had assigned all of the work to us, me and to my siblings, and would look through it, and together they would negotiate and figure out, okay, what's going to be the assignments tomorrow. And so that was kind of the homeschool that I'm talking about that we did. And the rest of the time really was a lot of, farming, playing, just being kids, really. We had a banana farm, I think almost 3 acres of bananas, and we produced bananas. So I still remember going into the garden and carrying bananas from what we call the flat. It was the flat area of the piece of land. And so it was all the way down to the bottom of the plantation, and then you would climb up to get to the top by where the vehicles would actually park. So there was a really interesting dynamic in terms of always having to go to the farm like 6 o'clock in the morning sometimes to start the day and to produce bananas on banana days, which I think tended to be Tuesdays or Thursdays. I can't remember anymore. Climbing ladders, deflowering bananas, and falling in mud and cooking food out there and bathing in the river. So these were the kinds of experiences that I had as a child. Quite, I would say, sort of based on land, relationships to the land and relationships to nature.
It looks like you did not spend any time looking at an iPad or iPhone when you were young.
Oh, definitely not. My father was very strict
I'm just
about,
joking, of course.
no, he was very strict though
Okay.
about having his children stay away from technological devices. In fact, we never had a television growing up until I was 16. So I never watched television, you're right, never had a cell phone, never interacted with computers until I was 16 and had gone to Trinidad and Tobago. And so very much quite nature oriented, I would
Mhm.
say.
You mentioned Tobago and Trinidad.
Yes.
How close are those islands? And because what I know from my own knowledge of
Hmm.
St. Lucia, it is a part of West Indies.
Yes,
Okay.
Trinidad and Tobago is. Hmm.
And we in India, like, big fans of West Indies, the West Indian cricketers.
Oh, and we are big fans of you guys too,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Okay, great. And Darren Sammy, if I'm not wrong, he
Yes.
comes from your part of the world.
Yes, Darren Sammy is St. Lucian, and
Mhm.
I believe he was the West
Captain.
Indies captain for the team,
Yes.
but I don't think he is anymore.
Do you follow cricket at all?
I used to a
Okay.
lot, and I
Okay.
feel like that's one of the things I'm trying to get back to
Mm.
now that I'm tenured.
Okay.
Um, trying to get back to that love for cricket and love for our West Indian teams, but I no longer follow it as I used to.
So we have more than one thing in common. You said that you also might have some Indian heritage in you.
Definitely. My grandfather was an Indian. My
Wow.
grandfather was literally fully Indian, if you want to refer to it that way, as in his hair and everything. And it was quite interesting because my mom, we call her a Dougla because she's mixed with Afro and Indian. When I asked her about my grandfather, who died when I was a child, I would ask, is he coming out of the Indian, as in indentured um, workers who came, or is he coming out of the indigenous Indians who literally we had in the Caribbean, Caribs, and Arawak. So I'm still trying to find out, uh, who was he? Where did he come from? And what does that mean for us, for me? Having that heritage, that's sort of what I call blood flowing through my veins. In fact, when I did my forward for my recent book, I talk about my Indian ancestors and how I feel disconnected from them, but I also sometimes see them in some of the things that I do and some of the ways that I orient myself to the world.
Beautiful. That's such a wonderful, story, the backstory of
Yes,
your heritage and where you're from.
yes, yes,
So, looks like you had a beautiful childhood, and also a little bit different because you had homeschooling, right?
yes.
And then did you go? You also went to university and got a master's there or an undergrad? What?
So yeah, I
Yeah.
did my undergrad in Trinidad, so that's why it's part of my story. I got there at 16 and started my college degree at 16, and so that is where a lot of my orientation to the real world began. I call it my formative years because it's where I went, outside of the home into full time college, really immersed into a formal educational sort of system.
Mhm.
And it's where I did my associate degree, which was a teacher training degree for 2 years, and then 4 years of elementary education with a focus on English, which is another connection I think that we do have to the creative writing. I did a lot of my work on creative writing in
Mhm.
that degree.
Very nice. What made you come to the United States?
I came to the United States because I had finished my undergraduate degree and was working in Trinidad as a teacher. And I was quite um, disappointed that I couldn't get children to pass exams in literacy, which was one of my passions. I loved teaching English language arts, we call it back home. But they would not necessarily always pass the test in the ways that people wanted them to. These were children coming out of the neighboring areas where I taught. Violent ridden sorts of places, lots of abusive sorts of environments. I had children leaving my class and running away from their homes in the middle of the day. We would have to be searching for them in the community. So these were very traumatized sorts of students. And I felt that even though that was the case, that I would have wanted them to perform on these tests in ways that they were probably not necessarily oriented to. And so I wanted to leave Trinidad because at the time I was working in a clinic, what's called a reading clinic, with my then mentor, Dr. Hyacinth McDowell. And she had shown me how to do interventions with literacy, how to assess students, how to help them to be better and to get better at English literacy. At the time, I didn't know much about other types of
Mhm.
literacies, so I didn't have any regard for them. I wanted to sound great as a teacher. I wanted my students to sound great, and that meant speaking English in a certain way and doing it with all of what I tend to refer to now as the pomp and circumstance of the queen. That is what was valued back then, and that is what I tended to want to be able to do, and I wanted my students to do that. So I left Trinidad because they did not have a literacy program, the master's program in literacy. And I was trying to find a university that did.
And you found it here in Florida.
Yes, I found it here, USF, where I'm now. I was back here. This is where I did my master's degree. And my cousin at the time was here at USF, told me about the university, and that's how I chose it as one of the places to apply to, and applied to literacy studies and took a year. And I thought I was going back home to run the clinic,
Hmm.
which my friend had taught me very well how
After the
to do.
PhD,
Yeah, after the
after the
master's
master.
degree.
Okay.
In fact, I was very focused on going back until USF recruited me and said, hey, why don't you apply to our PhD program?
Mm.
So I was really committed to going back and running the clinic and to improving what I felt were those literacy skills for so many students, even adults as well, that we served with Dr. Hyacinth in Trinidad.
So, tell me a little bit about your how you navigated the challenges of speaking English with a different accent, and this is what your major work is now, or the recent book is about. And did you have any trouble at all, or people like um, saw you as different because you spoke English perfectly, but not like an American?
Yeah, I think that starting off, I did notice the differences very clearly. In fact, I think people, you're racialized as Black in the US. People initially see you, they don't really expect the accent necessarily. And so initially, it was very clear that once I started speaking, which I tended to do a lot less of back then, once I started speaking, then you sort of saw people either become very silent or make sorts of snide remarks or make sarcastic remarks or be very direct. For instance, one of the first responses I talk about in one of my articles somewhere is how a staff member at one of the schools where I was enrolling my daughter on day 2 or 3 of getting to the US, she said to me, I didn't know you all spoke English so well over there. Don't you just swing in trees like, and I thought this was quite intriguing because there was the sort of opposite response of, oh, you shouldn't be speaking English so well, whatever that was, or whatever that person felt that was.
How did you feel about that?
I think I can be very interesting in my responses to remarks like this. And one of the kinds of responses I tend to give is to smile and to laugh about something and to focus on the task that I came to do. In that specific instance, I wanted to get my daughter into school. And so it's very focused on that specific goal. And so I laughed about, oh, no, we do speak English in the Caribbean. I just kept focused on the task. So I didn't allow, in many cases, and now I'm very intentional about this, but back then I think I was just doing it more subconsciously.
You don't usually allow it to derail you.
Derail me. So I'm remaining intentionally focused on what I'm setting out to do. And now what I call meta linguistic and metacultural and meta racial understanding. I'm thinking about how you're thinking about my use of English based on my race, but I know I have this thing to do, and I'm not going to engage you by giving you what I call my energy so that you can derail my process
This
in
is
this moment.
beautiful.
Yes.
So you basically thinking about what they might be thinking about you.
Exactly. And I talk about that in my book. In my book, I articulate how students and transracialized people across nations have these assets that they're already using subconsciously, but how do we make that visible to them so they can actually use these assets very strategically so they remain focused on where they're trying to go and the purpose that they came into the world for. Otherwise, people can derail your purpose. You can spend a lot of time focusing on things that, yes, they matter, but in the moment, you need to be able to get to where you're trying to go. And in that case, it was all about my daughter getting into the school and me portraying the kind of empathy or the kind of forgiveness that would get my daughter to be seen as someone that would get into the school.
It's so interesting. It's basically you're saying that you people who speak Englishes from different countries, after coming to America, living here
Mhm.
for certain years, they begin to listen to understand rather than listen to respond or react.
Exactly, exactly. And I think people do that to varying degrees. So I study now in my research, to what degree do certain people do that versus others? To what degree do certain people evolve in their capacity to strategically leverage their metalinguistic, metacultural, metaracial understanding, which is they're thinking about how they think about race or how others think about their race, thinking about how others think about their language or how they do that. How does that evolve in certain people versus others? And why does it evolve in certain people so that they are seen as what we call successful, when it's really that a lot of these people are focused on their purpose and are able to strategically leverage the assets they have to aspire and remain focused on that purpose.
Thank you so much. Do you have a copy of the book by any chance here, lying around
Uh,
somewhere?
this is embarrassing. It's at home
Or
in my
maybe you can
home
show it on
office.
your computer.
Yeah,
Pull it up.
definitely. Let me
So
try
this
to.
is, when did this come out? Only recently, right?
Yeah, November 24th, 2023.
Hmm.
I'm very excited about this book and I'm just so eager to share it with the world.
I just want to show it to people, just a copy. We can talk about it. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Let me try to. Oh, my internet is down.
Okay. We can. Don't worry about it. We can cut it off the bad parts.
I should have brought. Oh, it's right here.
Okay. Just there you go. Okay. Look at this. I'm gonna go to. This is the book. Black Immigrant Literacies.
Literacies, intersections of race, language, and culture in the classroom.
Very good. So, how long did it take for you to write this book?
I got the invitation to write this book after I completed a presentation at the LRA conference,
Mhm.
Literacy Research Association conference. I believe that was 2020.
Mhm.
So I got the invitation to write the book in that December of 2020, I believe. And then I took, so it's probably almost 3 years.
3 years. And what does this focus on? Mostly on different kinds of Englishes.
Yes, I kind of focus initially on the broad overview of what I call Black immigrant literacies,
Hmm.
which really has to do with how our race, language, and cultural immigration intersecting together to affect the literate practices of Black immigrants. And so I focus at first on that broad, overarching, what I call a framework. And I talk about different kinds of Black immigrants just minimally, and then I go into two Caribbean youth who are part of a broader study. And I talk about their experiences with race, language, and immigration in the United States. What did that look like? How did teachers respond to that before they came here in their home countries? And what does it look like here to be racialized? When the Caribbean, it happens similarly, not similarly, but it happens in other ways. For instance, with curriculum, it happens with colonization sorts of norms that look different from what typically happens more overtly in the United States.
Very nice, very interesting. Also, do you think the black immigrants who come from English-speaking world, like, um, and when they speak, they look, of course, African American. When they come here, do African American people who are from America, grew up here, how do they see black migrants? Do they think of them as um, like just black people, or they
Mhm.
think no, these are immigrants? What is going on there?
That's quite a nuanced sort of conversation. I've been following it for almost 10 years in the
Mhm.
online world, looking to see what are the conversations. And then, of course, I've been researching it in my own work
Mhm.
and hearing students and educators talk about the nuance. I think my response to that would be it depends on who you are as an African American, based on what I've seen in the research I've done. There are certain participants who describe African Americans' responses to them as, being sort of negative. There are those who describe the experiences as being quite positive, right? So you have this nuanced sort of response, I think, across what is probably a spectrum in terms of the responses that Black immigrants get, but also a nuance in terms of the responses that Black immigrants give as well, right? So, for instance, in my book, Jada talked about being a middle school student and experiencing really significant challenges because of how she spoke across four middle schools with her Caribbean Englishes and being bullied by lots of different populations, white.
Jada is, I'm thinking, 12 years old.
Jada was about, yeah, about 12, 13 years old at the time when she described those experiences. And she was talking about how she experienced negativity from multiple groups: white students, from brown students, from Black students. And so I think one of the things that I've noticed is that we really want to avoid making broad assumptions about what all African Americans do in relation to immigrants and vice versa, because there is a huge sort of tension there. And I'm trying to understand the tensions and what causes them. And I'm trying to understand how do we bring the groups together in solidarity, and that I want us to be able to bridge these gaps between populations that I think do have quite a lot of differences, but also some of the dearest people that I have come to love and who have mentored me in the academy have been African American sisters. And by that I refer to individuals perceived as African American. Because the other thing to think about is
Mm.
a lot of folks are now both African American and Black immigrants. You have now an increasing conflation of those terms. And I think we've got to address that as well, right? How are people both of these, but at the same time perceived as one and not the other?
Wow, so beautiful. So the book is already out, right?
Yes, so
And
that book is out.
okay, this one, Black Immigrant Literacies.
Intersections of race, language, and culture in the classroom. But there's another Cambridge University Press book coming out this year,
Different book.
and Languaging Imaginaries of Innocence. It's a completely different book.
Very interesting. And that is coming out this year.
Cambridge University Press.
And which press did this got printed from?
Teachers College
Teachers
Press.
College.
This is more of a practical book.
Okay.
And the other book that's coming out is a
Scholarly
scholarly
book. Okay.
very focused on really getting at a lot of these theoretical tensions, but then showing how it occurred in the lives of Black youth.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So you that book is obviously done, also written.
Oh yeah, it's in copy editing right now, and I'm
Okay.
knee deep in trying to get
All right.
all those edits. Yes.
You're doing some wonderful work, and thank you so much for your time to talk to me. Also, do you want to add anything about your work and you about life in America in general? Our yeah.
Yeah, I would say that, I'm really excited about Black immigrant literacies, not as a way to focus on Blackness only, but also as a mechanism for helping us to see the world in the nuanced ways that it evolves. And by that, I mean that, when we think about race, language, and immigration, Black people are not the only people, engaging and experiencing the tensions that I talk about in my book and in my work. This is happening across a spectrum of races and ethnicities. And what I'm really trying to do is say, here is what literacy tends to look like when we think of literacy from a traditional perspective. But then when we read the book Black Immigrant Literacies, we realize that making meaning with words and with text becomes so much broader than just sitting down and trying to pronounce a word in English.
Makes it more interesting than just saying this is this and that is that.
Exactly.
Right.
So yeah, so the nuances, bridging dichotomies, making clear that intersectional parts of who we are come to bear as a central part of literacy research and teaching.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Smith, for talking to me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.